So my name is Bennett Meares. I'm a senior computer science student. And so whereas Austin was working more at the server or like sensor level, I primarily oversee our databases. So I've got a lot to go through and a little bit of time, so I'll just give you a brief overview. So my job primarily is a quote-unquote data engineer, which means it's my job to take data from point A and move it to point B and convert it into a useful format. Another part of my job is performance, performance, performance. Everyone else depends on my data for access, for analysis, so it's important to me that I give them the newest data as soon as possible without blowing up the server. So I work as a server administrator where I just schedule different scripts and just have load balancing just to make sure that I keep the gears running smoothly. So let me give you a scope of the problem when I came into this, and then I'll go into my solutions, and I'll close it off with just a few brief examples. So you've heard the terms Jci Historian Database. Whenever we say that, just imagine a huge water tank. And in this water tank, there's 4.5 billion, that's billion with a B, records. It's a giant server, and most of all the standard JCI sensors, from temperature sensors, CO2 and all that, they all end up in this server where we just store them for later analysis. Although the servers that facilities has is extremely powerful, parsing through 4.5 billion records is extremely expensive, and it takes up to an hour just to aggregate for huge data sets. Let's say for one building's worth of data. So my job, so let's see, too much data, it's mixed. I want to reduce redundant transfers, which means I don't want to copy the same record twice. For example, if I know what the temperature in room A was in 2015, it doesn't make sense to copy that over more than once. So my solution to this was I call it the CEVAC pipeline structure. Just to go back to the water analogy, I'm siphoning off the data I care about into these sub-vats. I'm trying to use an analogy here. So it's not exactly this literal, but in this example, I just have 3 here, but in our current production cycle, we have about 50 of these smaller tables. So going from 4.5 billion records to about 2 million is orders of magnitude faster, and for all intents and purposes, instant. It takes a few seconds to process, but it's a lot faster. This is more of an abstract view of actually what's happening, but I thought this would be more easy to understand. So a little more. This overview, this diagram kind of shows a big picture overview of how the data gets from Austin's stuff with the sensor level. It gets aggregated into Historian. Then I have a bunch of different tables that all depend on each other. You don't need to worry about the specifics. Then I have another server to process them, and then I put them on the SAS, where then they end up on the reports, and then the web interface, which you will see shortly. But let me give you a quick snapshot on some of these examples, because I do more than just move data from place to place. I also aggregate it in useful formats. So let's look at this one on the bottom first. This shows the different steps in the process to get our predictive power table. And you'll hear from Drew at the end of the presentation. But the data starts off in the facility server. It's parsed into the power table, which is, for example, watt power, that one there. That's further aggregated, so it goes from 2 million records, which, although a lot smaller than 4.5 billion, is still pretty large, down to 60,000 useful records, which is power sums, which is the power usage for the building at any given moment. From there, we train our model, we output another table, and then I combine those. So you'll notice as we aggregate further, the names get longer. And that was another thing, managing all the different table names. But even though it all stems from the same source, we get multiple different perspectives on the same data. Lastly, before I wrap this up, let's take a quick look at a real-time actual example snapshot of the data flow. So there's 3 different tables here. Let's start the first one, a hist view table. It's like that hist table on the top. you'll look here, it was cached at 825 or 1825 UTC. The part that's really important to look at are these two numbers. The row count figure is how physically big the table is. So in this case, Cooper Temp has about 10 million records. But this transaction that it's recording only transferred 390 records, which is much more manageable and easy for transfer for bandwidth use and whatnot. The same thing happens here. So the second row is identical for the metadata, the same numbers, but it's a different format. Whereas the first one was caching one table, the second one is creating the file. That represents the transaction from here to here, where I take the data and I put it in another format, which is ready to be loaded into SAS Visual Analytics. The final part is the latest table, which you can see in the green section. The latest tables have the most recent record. So with our current setup, it's at most 15 minutes, sometimes faster, delay, but we are working to get that to sub-minute intervals. And since there's only 13 records, it's practically constant time, very quick to transfer this table, because there's very little data. So you'll hear more about what happens from on these two sections, and I'd like to hand the mic over to Harrison. Thank you for listening.